Before we dive in, imagine a continent shaped by empires, revolutions, and centuries of untold stories. This is EuroHistory Hub. Hi, I'm Andrew, and welcome to the very first episode of EuroHistory Hub.
And I'm Elizabeth. We're excited to take you on a journey through the vast and fascinating history of Europe.
This is just the introduction. Follow us for more episodes and exciting content coming soon.
That's right. In this deep dive, and the ones to follow, we'll be exploring thousands of years of history.
And for today, our source is foundational. The introduction to Norman Davies' monumental work, Europe, a History.
Yes, and what's really interesting is Davies doesn't just jump into, kings and battles.
Right.
He starts by looking at how we even think about history, how it's written, how it's maybe even twisted sometimes. It's about understanding the lens itself.
Exactly. So this isn't just about dates and events. It's more like the history of history, but focused squarely on Europe, understanding the craft behind it all.
And straight away, Davies challenges some common ideas. You'll see how concepts like Europe or Western civilization weren't always fixed. They've been shaped, often by specific agendas,
So we're kind of offering a shortcut here to get to the heart of these underlying issues.
That's the idea, to help you get really well informed without drowning in, endless detail.
Okay, so where does a historian even start with something as huge as Europe? Davies talks about history being written at different magnifications, doesn't he?
He does. Think of it like a spectrum. On one end, you have this story of a historian who wrote books on smaller and smaller time chunks.
Oh yeah, I remember that bit. From the Munich crisis, then
Right.
the last week of peace.
And finally, a whole book just on 31 August 1939.
Wow. That's really getting, as Davies puts it, more and more about less and less. A modern compulsion, for sure.
Precisely. It shows that intense focus on tiny details. But then on the other end, you've got these massive single-volume attempts, like Davies' own book, trying to squeeze everything in.
So the scale you choose, the magnification, completely changes what you see, like zooming on a map.
Exactly right. Which is, totally different from how a poet might approach it.
Ah yes, the source has that fascinating little poem, sketching Europe so economically. If Europe is a nymph, Naples the eye, Warsaw the heart.
Paris the head, London the collar, Rome the scapulary. It's incredibly concise.
So how does that snapshot compare to what historians usually do?
Well, while that's a quick sketch, actual historical studies, monographs, they've become super specialized, really narrow. And the big general surveys, they often stick to a kind of standard zoom level, maybe a few hundred pages a century.
And they tend to focus more on recent times, right?
They do, yeah. Even though people like Sir Walter Raleigh warned about the dangers of writing modern history too close to the truth. Might get your teeth knocked out, he said.
Huh? A vivid warning. It highlights how tough it is to survey all of European history well. Truly comprehensive books are rare.
And the ones that do exist often lean heavily on this slightly tricky idea of Western civilization.
Which, as Davies points out, can be a bit dubious.
Right, because focusing just on Western civ often means leaving massive parts of Europe out of the picture entirely. The more successful grand surveys often pick a single theme, like Kenneth Clark looking at art and civilization, or Bernowski tracing science in The Ascent of Man.
Often linked to big TV series, interestingly. Suggests you need a specific angle to make the vastness accessible.
It does, which leads to this problem with specialization. Those huge, multi-volume histories, they end up being reference works. You consult them, you don't really read them cover to cover.
Yeah, it feels like a missed opportunity for really getting immersed.
It is, because everyone just assumes the basic framework is sorted, and they dive into their tiny little niche, that more and more about less and less again.
Forgetting the bigger picture.
Exactly, but history needs all those levels of magnification. You need the telescope for the big sweeps, the microscope for individual lives, and like a geological probe to dig deep down.
That's a great way to put it. Historians need a whole toolkit. And the tools have expanded, haven't they? Computers for data, ideas from social sciences.
Oh, absolutely. The French Annals School, for example, brought in social science techniques. And think about all the newer fields: oral history, psychohistory, family history.
History of manners, even.
Right, plus all the contemporary issues, anti-racism, environment, gender, they're all getting historical dimensions now. Which, despite maybe some political correctness concerns people raise, it genuinely enriches the whole field.
That's a lot of new ground. But doesn't that create problems? So many fields, so many publications. Davies says historians despair of keeping up. What does that do to, say, narrative history?
It's a real issue. Some specialists just assume the big picture is fine and only focus on their narrow slice. Others go looking for deep structures and kind of ignore the conventional facts, the who, what, where, when.
Leading to students who, as the source worries, might not actually learn what happened.
That's the danger. And you also see things like empathy exercises in schools replacing factual learning sometimes. Imagination is vital, of course, but without the knowledge,
It's potentially risky.
well, yeah. And Davies points to this unfortunate split between history and literature. Things like structuralism, deconstructionism. Sometimes they got so caught up in how stories are told, they sidelined the actual substance, the facts.
But surely literary texts can be useful for historians.
Oh, definitely. A judicious historian uses them. But history needs that creative historical imagination, as Avico called it. Otherwise, it's just dead facts, an unbroadcast message.
So bridging disciplines is key. But then there's postmodernism. Davies calls it a pastime that studies the historians, not the history, and attacks the very idea of facts.
Yes, the extreme view is that any statement about the past is basically an act of power, coercive. History just becomes whatever the historian feels like, maybe even a tool for politics.
That sounds pretty destructive.
It can be. But Davies argues for a pluralism of interpretation, safety in numbers, almost. Like a photographer taking lots of shots from different angles, you get a fuller picture, history in the round.
So perfect objectivity is impossible.
Absolutely unattainable, yes.
But historians need lots of different tools. Like doctors use x-rays and scans to get as close as possible.
Precisely. No single tool gives the perfect picture. You need the range. And this brings us right back to a core problem. What even is Europe?
Right. Davies says it's actually a pretty modern concept. It only gradually replaced Christendom between the 14th and 18th centuries.
With a big shift around 1700 after all those religious wars, people needed a more neutral term for this divided community.
So you get figures like William Penn suggesting a European parliament.
And Abbé de Saint-Pierre calling for a confederation, and geographically, the boundary shifted too. The ancients said the River Don.
But then in 1730, this Swedish officer, Strahlenberg, suggests the Ural Mountains.
Yeah, which led to that heartbreaking custom of Russian exiles grabbing a handful of European earth at the border post before heading to Siberia.
What a powerful image. But even that Ural border gets questioned later, right? Geographers talking about a tidal Europe.
Indeed. So the physical lines were always a bit blurry, and the idea of geographical Europe always competed with Europe as a cultural community. Since there wasn't one political ruler, culture became key, especially Christianity.
Like T.S. Eliot arguing after World War II that Europe's culture was based on Christianity, that even someone like Voltaire could only emerge from it.
But is that really accurate? Is it one single Christian monolith? Davies points out that things like the Renaissance love of antiquity or the romantic obsession with nature, they were pretty pagan, weren't they?
Good point. And modern trends, modernism, pop culture, they don't seem very connected to Christian heritage either.
Exactly. So very few would argue for a single European cultural monolith today. It's more complex, maybe like 4 or 5 overlapping circles, or as the novelist Moravia said, a reversible fabric.
A nice image. But yours wasn't just cultural. It also had political ideals, right? Often seen as this symbol of harmony, an unattainable ideal.
Yes, this sort of utopian view pops up again and again, from talks before the Treaty of Westphalia, through the balance of power idea, the Concert of Europe, even before 1914.
And it revived after the World Wars, in the League of Nations, and then the push for European integration in the West.
It did, creating a little Europe in the West that then became a kind of beacon for those behind the Iron Curtain. And after '89, you get the first real possibility of a pan-European community.
But it's always fragile. Bismarck just called it a geographical notion.
And Jean Monnet, one of the founding fathers of the EU, admitted Europe has never existed. One has genuinely to create Europe. It's an ongoing project.
A huge project. And so much seems to depend on Russia. Davies says Russia's inclusion or exclusion has been the cardinal problem for centuries.
Absolutely. Always the bad fit. Different religion, politics, economy. You see it back in 1517, a Polish scholar excluding Muscovy.
But then Catherine the Great insists Russia is a European state. And Russian culture, Tolstoy, Tchaikovsky, strengthens that claim.
Yet the internal Russian debate between Westernizers and Slavophiles raged on. And even after 1989, many, including Russian nationalists, remained skeptical about Russia truly being European.
And Britain. Davies says its European identity is no less ambiguous than Russia's. That's provocative.
It is. Early on, England was deeply involved on the continent. But later, building the empire pulled its focus overseas. They became semi-detached, viewing the continent from afar.
So early European unity movements just assumed Britain and Russia wouldn't be part of it.
Pretty much, yeah. It shows how fragmented the idea of Europe has always been, culturally too. People kept trying to carve it up into regions: Middle Europa, East Central Europe, the Cold Wars, East versus West.
And Milan Kundera trying to reclaim Central Europe as a spiritual concept.
Right, and what about the heart of Europe? Where even is it? Belgium, Poland, Bohemia? It's elusive.
But people like Hugh Seton Watson kept the idea of European unity alive during the Cold War. What were his key points?
He stressed three things: needing a European mystique beyond just economics, the vital complementary roles of East and West, and the sheer pluralism of Europe's culture: Christian, Roman, Greek, Jewish, Persian influences.
So European culture is this incredible mix, the end product of 3,000 years of labor.
Exactly, a heritage to preserve and renew. Which leads us neatly into another big challenge: Eurocentrism.
Which isn't just studying Europe, Davies clarifies, it's an attitude, right? Seeing European civilization as inherently superior, self-contained.
Yes, like Narcissus only seeing himself. Think of Guizot believing European civilization held the eternal truth. This kind of thinking is thankfully losing ground now.
Who's pushing back against it?
Well, several groups: Black communities focusing on Afrocentricity, religious fundamentalists in the Islamic world, Marxist thinkers in the Global South, and even many younger Europeans who are uncomfortable with past attitudes.
So how should historians move forward?
Davies suggests paying more attention to interactions with non-Europeans, using non-European sources, making honest comparisons, and just acknowledging that Europe's history is, a mixed bag, good and bad.
And this connects directly to unpacking the idea of Western civilization, doesn't it? For 200 years, it's often been confused with European history itself.
That confusion is key. The implication is that everything Western is civilized, and vice versa.
Which, as you said, leads to leaving huge areas out. Not just ignoring Islam, but ignoring parts of Europe itself. Portugal, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe.
It becomes like Gruyere cheese, more holes than cheese.
Yeah.
Davies gives examples like an Oxford history of medieval Europe that barely mentions Ireland or the massive Polish-Lithuanian state.
It sounds incredibly biased. He also tackles that classification of nationalism into Eastern and Western types.
Yeah, he really pulls that apart. Shows how the Eastern label gets slapped on Slavs based on limited examples, ignoring huge nations like Poland or Russia whose histories don't fit the model.
And the punchline is that the best fit for this supposedly Eastern type would actually be Irish nationalism.
Located in the far west of Western Europe, it just shows how these frameworks distort reality.
So, Western civilization isn't some neutral historical fact, it's more of an ideological construct.
Exactly. Davies calls it an amalgam of intellectual constructs, used for specific interests: ideology, identity trips, cultural propaganda.
And how does it work? What are the mechanisms?
He identifies four: reduction, shrinking history down to fit present concerns; elimination, just cutting out anything that doesn't fit; anachronism, projecting current divisions back onto the past; and biased language.
All serving to flatten Europe's real diversity and change over time, and presenting this sanitized image of the West.
Precisely. Just genius philosophers and pioneers, never the darker side. Though, of course, there were always counterclaims, especially from the East Orthodox, Russian, Soviet, arguing for their moral superiority over a supposedly decadent West.
Right, so separating Western civ from actual European history means cutting through these illusions and trying to see the whole continent north, south, east, west.
But that doesn't mean there aren't real divisions, right? Davies acknowledges important lines on the map.
Like what?
The oldest, maybe, is Catholic versus Orthodox Christianity, still relevant today. Then you have the old Roman frontier, the split between Western and Eastern Roman empires, the line marking Ottoman rule, and of course, the Iron Curtain.
Plus lines drawn by social scientists, like family structures.
Right. But the point is, Europe is probably better seen as 5 or 6 regions, not just 2, and Western dominance definitely hasn't been constant throughout history.
Okay, so if Western civ is problematic, what about focusing on national histories? That seems dominant now.
It is. Often, the national story overshadows the European one. Great Britain is a prime example. British history often means just English history, separate from European history.
Leading to this narrow view, assuming everything important happened within Britain's borders.
Exactly. And historically, school textbooks everywhere often pushed patriotism, sometimes even preparing kids for war.
Though things did change a lot after World War II in the West. And Davies mentions that interesting 1889 textbook from Austrian Galicia that tried a broader European approach.
It highlights that tension between breadth and depth. Even Soviet textbooks, for all their ideology, often covered a vast geographical and chronological sweep, much wider than, say, the traditional English focus on Tudors and Stuarts.
So English students might be good at analyzing sources.
But their knowledge base can be incredibly narrow, maybe only 5 or 10% of Europe's history. Davies half-jokingly suggests maybe a non-European needs to write the definitive European history.
Which brings us to those two big failed attempts at universal European histories. First, the Marxist-Leninist one.
Right, it started out quite internationalist, but Stalin twisted it into this weird mix of Marxism and Russian imperialism, with Russia as the elder brother.
Very Eurocentric, though, wasn't it? Despite claiming the West was decadent.
Deeply Eurocentric, yeah. And ultimately dreamed of a Soviet-led Europe Gorbachev's common European home.
And the second failed vision, the fascist Nazi one.
It started later, burned brighter and faster. Hitler's version focused on Aryan racism, the master race, and saw Eastern Europe simply as Lebensraum, living space, needing surgical removal of inferior peoples.
A horrifying vision.
Absolutely. Thankfully, its defeat prevented it from becoming a truly global ideology, keeping its main horrors within Europe.
So, after those ideologies collapsed, our current view is heavily shaped by what Davies calls the Allied scheme of history, from the World War and Cold War victories.
Yes. It wasn't a formal plan, but it's been pervasive. It has about 6 core assumptions.
Okay, what are they?
1, belief in a unique Western civilization peaking with the Atlantic community. 2, seeing anti-fascism as WWII's main story. 3, a fixation on Germany as the villain. 4, a somewhat romanticized view of Russia-Soviet Union as a key ally. 5, accepting the division of Europe into East and West as necessary for security. And 6, basically ignoring any facts that don't fit these assumptions.
Wow, that's quite a framework. How did it play out in practice?
Well, in academia, you saw tons of research on Nazis, but East European studies were often separate. Russian culture got huge emphasis. Inconvenient facts about WWII allies were downplayed. Wartime stereotypes persisted. Czechs good, Slovaks bad, Poles treacherous for resisting Soviets, Ukrainians barely existing.
And politically.
It underpinned things like the US-UK special relationship, keeping Germany and Japan off the UN Security Council initially. But the fall of communism in '89 really shook this scheme.
How so?
It showed how little the West really understood about the East. Suddenly, Russia wasn't the same as the Soviet Union. People realized they'd been misled, and the calls for revising European history grew louder.
Which leads to the idea of EuroHistory, a conscious effort after 1945 to build a shared European story, removing national biases.
Exactly. The Council of Europe was key here, promoting textbook commissions, trying to find common ground. But it got harder as the European community grew. Reconciling 6 members is one thing, 38 is another.
And that big EU-funded project, An Adventure in Understanding, it failed.
It did, sadly, mainly because it still focused too much on Western Europe, excluding the East. It became just another Western civilization exercise and faced strong criticism, especially from Greeks who felt left out. The EU eventually distanced itself.
So setbacks. But what's the underlying value of seeking a Euro history?
Its strength is searching for that shared vision, recognizing that nation-states aren't the only valid form of community. It's about building an imagined community. And for that, you need a compelling story of the shared past. Historians have a role in creating that sense of a shared spiritual home.
Really highlights how defining European history is still a live debate, even among historians.
Oh, definitely. Davies mentions a survey from 1986. A French historian recalled that in the 30s, European history was French history. Now the view is more like, there isn't one European history, there are many.
And A.J.P. Taylor's quote is classic.
Isn't it? History is whatever the historian wants. The only limit is it has to be about Europe. But he's not sure what Europe is, so he's pretty well in a haze about the rest. It shows how definitions can tie you in knots. Sometimes you just have to describe the camel, not define it.
So, what does this all mean for you listening to this, trying to grasp Europe? It's clear European history is way more complex, more contested than you might think. Not one story, but this huge, messy orchestra, often heard through biased speakers.
Indeed. The main takeaway is that understanding Europe means wrestling with its diversity and all the different ways its story has been told and, importantly, mistold. That idea of Western civilization, it's less a neutral description, more a constructed ideology that really affects how we see different parts of Europe and the wider world, too.
So as we finish this first exploration, here's something to think about. If the history we've learned was so often shaped by politics and bias, what does that suggest about the stories we hear today? About other places or even our own communities?
And maybe, how can actively looking for those different angles, using the different equipment historians need, help us build a more complete and more truthful history in the round for ourselves?